Chapter 9, Part 1, Nationalism and Sectionalism, 1815 to 1828. After reading the chapter, you should be able to achieve these core objectives. You do not need to answer these and turn them in. These are just for your information. James Monroe was the first president elected after the War of 1812. He was a Republican. He ran basically unopposed as there was no official Federalist candidate in 1816. James Monroe's presidency is often referred to as the era of good feelings because this is a time when America began to return to more normalcy after the War of 1812 and all of the political and economic uproar that comes with wars. However, this is a misnomer because there were many conflicts and crises that President Monroe had to deal with during his administration. When we look at Monroe, it's probably a testament to the way that he handled these crises that this era is called the era of good feelings. One of the crises that President Monroe had to deal with was the financial panic of 1819. Right after the War of 1812, there was a wave of prosperity that lasted for about 3 years. And during that time, as does happen during prosperous times, there was a lot of speculation, a lot of credit that was extended because things were going well, crop prices were high, and so things were going well. But beginning about 1818, prices began to drop for cotton and other food exports from the United States. That led to a restriction of credit, and that caused a reduction in commodity prices, and real estate values went down. During this time, the Bank of the United States, which was the primary bank in the country at the time, began to stop all loans to farmers, and they began to call in debts, trying to hold on to the money that they had. This is going to cause a great deal of bad feeling regarding the Bank of the United States throughout the Western territories and in the South. The Bank of the United States, or what was commonly referred to at the time as the National Bank, becomes a burning political issue, really pitting the northeastern states against the eastern and western states regarding their value of the bank. During the time immediately after the Louisiana Purchase, the Bank of the United States had begun to extend credit very easily to people who wanted to buy land in that new Louisiana territory. The reason for this was to populate the land with good American citizens. So in 1804, there was a Land Act that was passed that provided that people who wanted to buy this national land could buy a minimum of 160 acres of land at $2 an acre, and they could extend their payments over a 4-year time period. Now, this prompted a lot of people to begin to buy more than 160 acres of land, especially during those good economic times immediately after the War of 1812. But then as crop prices began to go lower, many of these debtors that had borrowed money to buy this land could not pay the money back to the bank, and that's why the bank began to restrict credit and began to call in loans. So there was, one of the reasons for the panic was this over speculation in land, people buying more land than they could really afford to pay for, and it came to a head in 1819. Well, to help rectify the depression or panic, Congress passed a new Land Act in 1820. The Land Act of 1820 reduced the minimum amount of land that individuals had to buy. They reduced it by half. Now the minimum amount was 80 acres instead of 160. They also reduced the price of the land to $1.25 per acre. So for $100, someone could buy a nice chunk of land. The caveat was, though, that you had to pay for the land in cash up front. There would be no credit extended. The idea with the Land Act of 1820 was it would still allow people to purchase land, but it would cause them to be more cautious and not overextend themselves and only buy the land that they could truly afford. The new Land Act of 1820 did help to rectify some of the problems that were caused by the Panic of 1819. Another big issue that Monroe had to deal with as president dealt with the old question of slavery, and especially the extension of slavery into the new states that were being carved out of the Louisiana Territory. All of this is going to come to a head around 1820. Missouri, in 1819, Missouri had reached the population requirements for statehood. They had written a state constitution, and they applied for statehood. Until we get to Missouri, it was pretty much just a given that when a state applied for statehood, if they met the minimum requirements, they were granted statehood. Well, when Missouri applied for statehood in 1819, there is a little bit of an issue. At this time, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. So no matter how Missouri decided on the slavery issue, it will upset the balance of power between the free states and the slave states in the country. And at this time, Missouri adopted slavery and permitted slavery in their new state constitution. So when Missouri's application for statehood went to the House of Representatives, the House of Representatives approved it, but they added an amendment called the Talmadge Amendment to Missouri's application for statehood, in which they said that Missouri could enter the Union as a slave state, but no new slaves could be brought into Missouri, and the children born to slave parents would be granted their freedom when they reached adulthood. So basically what would happen with the Talmadge Amendment is that after a generation or two, slavery would actually fade out of existence in Missouri. The Talmadge Amendment passed the House of Representatives because there were more northern representatives, because the North had a larger population than the South. So it was able to pass the House of Representatives. But when it got to the Senate, because there is a balance of power with each state having 2 senators, the Southern senators were able to prevent the Talmadge Amendment from passing. So this brings us to a standstill over Missouri's statehood. And there begins to be a great deal of debate and concern. There were proposals for the southern states to have a convention. There was even mention that maybe the southern states should begin to secede from the Union. Everyone is very concerned because up until this time, Congress has never intervened in a state's application for statehood and never intervened on a slavery issue, whether if the South wanted to be slave or if a state wanted to be free. They never interfered. So now the South is concerned that if they can interfere in Missouri, then they can interfere in all new states that apply for statehood, and maybe even begin to interfere in slavery within their own states. So there is a great deal of concern in the South, and so there were some hotheads that began to push that maybe the South should even secede from the Union as early as 1820. However, there were enough people that kept calm during the situation, and a leader emerged, Henry Clay, who will propose a compromise to rectify the situation. Henry Clay becomes what's known as the Great Compromiser because he's going to put forth a couple of good compromises that keep the Union together over the next 40 years until it falls apart in the Civil War in 1860. But at this time, he authored what we termed the Missouri Compromise. Under the terms of the Missouri Compromise, Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state without the Talmadge Amendment. The Talmadge Amendment goes away. It's never adopted. To maintain the balance of power in the Senate, Maine, which had also applied for statehood, Maine would be admitted as a free state. So you get one free state, one slave state, so the balance of power is maintained. This will be the role that will, the formula that will be followed by the states up for the next 30 years until we get to 1850, when it will no longer work. Now, that solved that current problem, but we still have this issue of, we have this vast Louisiana territory, and we know Missouri is not going to be the only state that's going to seek admission out of this new territory. So what do we do to prevent this huge situation from occurring every time a state is carved out of the Louisiana territory? So they drew a line, Congress drew a line at the 36° 30 mark, and they said that no new states, no slaves could be brought in to new states above the 36° 30 mark. No slave states above 36° 30. Below the 36° 30 mark, the states could choose whether they wanted to have slavery or not. They're not forced to be slave states, they can choose it. The Missouri Compromise settled the situation at the time, and it is really a very good thing that they did, because when we look at the Missouri Compromise preventing secession and probably the Civil War in 1820, it really helped ensure the fact that the North would win the Civil War. In 1820, the North and the South were more equal, especially regarding economics and industry. And those two things, economics and industry, is what really helps the North defeat the South in the Civil War that happens in the 1860s. So it was really important that the Civil War would be postponed until the 1860s to ensure that the North would win the Civil War. And it's important that the North won the Civil War. If the South had won the Civil War, we wouldn't be the great country that we are today. We would be two smaller countries and not as economically viable as we are. So the Missouri Compromise is very significant because it postponed the Civil War. It helped preserve the Union for the next 40 years. But it's also one of those kind of strange turning points in history too, because what we also begin to see is, after the Missouri Compromise, the South never feels really safe in the Union. They always feel like they're being picked on because of what they termed their peculiar institution, their institution of slavery. And so now every time an issue comes up, whether it's a tariff issue or adding a new state or a trade issue, almost anything, the South goes back and says, you know, you don't like us because we have slavery. And so what we began to see happening in the South is this phenomenon that's sometimes referred to as Southern nationalism, where Southern states really began to take more pride in being Southern, more pride in being from their particular state than being American. And so that's very significant, because as we move closer to the Civil War, we see that many of the people that actually fought in the Confederate Army were not slave owners. So there had to be something that they were fighting for. They weren't fighting to preserve slavery. They didn't own slaves. So what were they fighting for? They were fighting for their state. They were fighting for their region because they felt that they were being picked on. So this Southern nationalism was a huge factor in helping the Confederates gain enough support to actually have the Civil War. This map shows us what the country looked like regarding free enslaved states and free enslaved territories after the Missouri Compromise. You can see the light green states were the free states. The ones in that kind of peachy color are the slave states. And then the stripes areas, those are your territories. When you look at that line right above what's termed the Arkansas Territory, that is the 36° 30 line. So everything above the Arkansas Territory, with the exception of the new state of Missouri, had to be free. Missouri will be a slave state under the Missouri Compromise, but everything else above that line has to be free. Below that line, beginning with that area that's termed the Arkansas Territory, you could have slavery if you so desired. Now, when we look at this map, we see that there eventually will be more free states than slave states if this map doesn't change. So why do you think the South agreed to this disparity? Well, it really has to do with geography. The Southerners realized that above that line, very few states would be able to sustain things like cotton and tobacco, which were the big plantation crops which needed slavery as their labor source. So they're not really giving up anything because they know slavery probably won't go above the 36° 30 line anyway. Below that line, you're looking at eventually, the states that will be Arkansas, that will be Oklahoma. So there was the possibility that slavery could extend into those areas because cotton especially would grow in those regions. Another area that Monroe had to deal with where he had problems was in foreign policy. During the time that Monroe was president, Spain began to have problems in her North American and Latin American colonies. Many of the Latin American colonies beginning in the 18 teens and 1820s began to break away from Spain, fight Spain for their freedom. And Spain desperately wanted to hold on to areas like Mexico, Argentina, because those areas gave them a great deal of wealth. And so Spain began to pull their troops out of Florida, which was one of their North American colonies, because Florida was not heavily populated. It didn't have a great deal of economic value for the Spanish. Well, when the Spanish armies became less populous in Florida, the native population, the Seminole Indians, began to try to regain control of their lands, and to use the terminology of the time, the Seminoles went on the warpath. They had what was known as the Seminole War. Well, the interesting thing about the Native Americans, obviously, is that they don't recognize these artificial boundaries that the Western countries have drawn in the Americas. And so when the Seminoles began to attack the Spanish in Florida, they also began to make raids across the Florida border into Georgia. So this, of course, involved the United States. So President Monroe sent General Andrew Jackson from, War of 1812 fame, down to Georgia to protect the American borders. Now, when he sent Jackson down, he told Jackson that he could pursue the Seminoles into Florida if he had to. He preferred if he didn't, but he could pursue the Seminoles into Florida if he had to. But if he did go into Florida, he was to respect Spanish sovereignty. Well, Andrew Jackson, as we know, is a very gung-ho military leader. And so when he gets down to Georgia, he decided that the only way he could protect the American territories was to defeat the Seminoles. And so he pursued them into Florida. And immediately after he moved into Florida, he began to violate Spanish sovereignty. He captured a couple of Indian chiefs and he hanged them. He even arrested a couple of British subjects who he claimed had been selling weapons to the Indians. He even took control of 2 Spanish forts along the Panhandle region of Florida, St. Mark's and Pensacola. So obviously, he's greatly exceeded his orders from the president. But the Spanish government is very preoccupied with the civil wars in Latin America, so they just appealed to the United States. They filed a protest, hoping, that we would call Andrew Jackson home and probably apologize to them and maybe even pay him a little money for the problems we had caused. But they're going to be very surprised, because when they filed their complaint, John Quincy Adams, who is our Secretary of State at the time, actually turned it all completely back around on them. He told the Spanish that it was their fault that Andrew Jackson had to go into Florida, and they actually should be thanking us for taking care of their Indian problem for them, that we had to do this to protect our territory. And he also demanded that Spain either control the Indians in the region or give the area to the United States. So the Spanish were kind of caught a little off guard, I assume. And one of the things that the Spanish didn't want at this time, they didn't want problems with the United States. Florida was not that valuable to them. They're very preoccupied with these civil wars in Latin America. So they decided that they would, in fact, cede or give the Florida territory to the United States. So this problem in Florida ends with what we call the Adams-Onis Treaty. Sometimes it's also referred to as the Florida Purchase Treaty. Under the terms of the Adams-Onis Treaty, Spain will give the United States Florida. Spain will also give the United States her claim to Oregon. Now, that does not give the United States Oregon, because Great Britain claimed Oregon, the United States claimed Oregon, and Spain had claimed Oregon. So now Spain is giving us their claims, so there'll still be two claimants to Oregon, the United States and Great Britain. We'll take care of that later. And the United States will give up any claims that we have to Texas. We didn't really have any credible claims to Texas, but there were some that were trying to claim that parts of Texas were part of the Louisiana Purchase, but we will give up any of our claims that we have to Texas. They will also draw a boundary line for the Louisiana Purchase territory. This map shows us the results of that Adams-Onis or Florida Purchase Treaty. If you will see, now we see all of this in the green area is the United States territory. We see the this little line along that Spanish possession territory, going from the Sabine to the Red to the Arkansas River. You'll see that kind of zigzaggy line that's going to go all the way up to the 42nd parallel, and then we'll draw a line across from the 42nd parallel to the Pacific Ocean. And so that draws a definite border between American possessions and Spanish possessions in North America. The problems in Latin America with the Latin American revolutions continued to plague President Monroe's administration. Actually, in many ways, the Latin American revolutions were beneficial to the United States, because once these countries like Mexico broke away from Spain, we are then free to trade with them. As long as they were colonies of Spain, we couldn't trade with them. So in many ways, these Latin American revolutions were very good for us, and we were benefiting from that. The British were also benefiting from the Spanish revolutions against the Spanish control in Latin America. But the British became concerned that these new republics that were being created in Latin America would be easily taken over by more aggressive countries, like perhaps Germany or France in particular. And so that they actually came to the United States with a proposal that the United States and Great Britain should make a joint declaration warning other European countries not to intervene in the new republics in Latin America. John Quincy Adams, as our Secretary of State, was the one that received this proposal. John Quincy Adams was a little wary of making a joint declaration, going back, as we remember, to President Washington's concerns about entangling foreign alliances. And so John Quincy Adams came up with the idea that the United States should make the declaration, but we should make it ourselves. We should cut the British out of it. So basically, we stole the idea of what became known as the Monroe Doctrine from the British. And President Monroe, in his State of the Union address in 1823, will make what becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, in the Monroe Doctrine, the United States warns European countries not to intervene in the affairs of countries in Latin America, and he warned European countries not to colonize in the Americas. He's specifically referring really to Latin America when he makes this warning. So basically he's saying the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, is off limits for colonization. You had your chance, it's over. And in exchange for that, he also promises that the United States will not intervene in European affairs. So basically, what we're saying in the Monroe Doctrine is, you mind your business, we'll mind ours. The interesting thing about the Monroe Doctrine is it really is just a presidential proclamation by the U.S. president. It doesn't hold any significance like a treaty would. It's not something that was declared by the World Court or anything like that. It's just basically saying, you mind your business, we'll mind ours. But it has held up for almost 200 years. The Monroe Doctrine really has established that the United States is the protector of the Western Hemisphere. Sometimes our protection is wanted and needed by our Latin American neighbors. Sometimes it has not been wanted, but we have asserted that protection anyway. But it really has, for almost 200 years, kept colonization out of the Americas. We will see that, eventually the European countries will be defeated in all across South America, and those countries will all become independent. In the beginning, the U.S. did not have the military power to really back up the Monroe Doctrine, but we knew the British were on our side too, and there were very few attempts at circumventing the Monroe Doctrine. Now, today, of course, we have the military power to back it up. The Monroe Doctrine is still very much a part of American foreign policy. Some of our strongest allies are in Latin America and Canada, obviously. Sometimes that relationship has been rocky because we have been overly assertive. But sometimes it has been a good, cordial relationship. If you think about whenever there's a disaster, a hurricane or earthquake hits in Latin America, the United States is the first country to go in and help those. So it's been a kind of an up and down relationship, but it is something that is still very much a part of American foreign policy.